Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for coming out tonight. It's our pleasure to have back with us Phillip Margolin, and in his fifth Robin Lockwood legal thriller. So, Phil, you started Robin. What was the inspiration for Robin, a female attorney, amazingly from Oregon?
Well, actually from the Midwest.
Well, sorry,
so
practicing
ending up in Oregon, yeah.
Right.
So what happened was I moved from HarperCollins to St. Martin's, and they wanted me to do a series. And I was thinking about, I have a lot of my books have very strong female characters in the lead. So in real life, if a man and a woman got in a fight, the man's probably going to win just because of upper body strength. Men will do combat sports and that type of thing. So I was trying to think, a lot of my women get in dangerous situations, and I was thinking, how could I make it realistic if Robin got into a fight that she would win? And I said, oh, make her a professional fighter. So the backstory with Robin was a lot of fun developing that. She grows up in the Midwest in a small town in Elk Grove, and her father and her three older brothers were all champion wrestlers. So when she goes to high school, she wants to be on the wrestling team. So she goes out, but a bunch of the parents don't want a girl wrestling with their boy children, so they convince the school board to get her banned. So her dad's a fighter, and he hires a lawyer, and they sue the school board, and then they get support from the wrestling coach and a lot of the people and the kids on the team, and they win. And she decides she wants to be a lawyer when she grows up, because she saw this lawyer get her justice. So when she competes, she becomes the first girl to place in her wrestling conference. She takes third place her senior year. But then when she goes to college, she's at a Division I school where they have a top nationally ranked wrestling team. So she doesn't even bother to try out. There's no way she could ever make it at that level. But she finds a gym where they teach mixed martial arts, and she starts practicing that. And by the time the book series, or by the time she gets into Yale Law School, she's also really smart. So she's a physics major and gets into Yale Law School. So by the time she gets into Yale, which is the hardest law school in the country to get into, she's ranked 9th nationally, and she's fighting on television on pay-per-view events in Las Vegas. So I establish her as being really very proficient at fighting. And in her first year in law school, the book I'm working on now, I go into the background of what happens, but basically it's in some of the books too. She gets really beat up in a fight with one of the top contenders, and decides that she's better off not fighting anymore. She gets a concussion and short-term memory loss, and decides she's better off fighting with the professors in law school where they can't kick her head in.
Did you see, Phil, in the New York Times Magazine, they did a study, I think it was last weekend, how women, victims of domestic violence, have a higher rate of concussion and brain injury and damage than football players.
Well, I'm not surprised. I don't know if you know this or not, but one of my specialties when I practiced law, I pioneered the use of the battered women syndrome as a defense in murder cases.
Yeah, we talked about that, yeah.
So I read, I did 4 homicide cases with battered women who killed their abusive spouse, and did a lot of research and talked to experts about it. And so I'm not the least bit surprised, because some of the violence that I saw that these women went through was pretty horrific. So I'm not shocked by that statistic in the least.
No, but I mean, it contributes to the whole syndrome of why they stay, because, they suffer disorientation and depression and all kinds of things resulting from the brain injuries, which makes it harder for them to leave. And, I think it's an interesting study that a signal to, if they go for medical attention, for physicians and all to look for that kind of thing. In this book, Phil is going to be talking about the shaken baby syndrome, which is not dissimilar. So, the head turns out to be remarkably fragile. I mean, really hard, but at the same time, can be.
Yeah, the idea for the book came from a 2-day seminar. Oregon Criminal Defense Lawyers Association is a fabulous organization, and I'm still a member of, even though I haven't practiced since 1996. So I still get material about seminars. And they had a 2-day seminar on junk science out at the coast. About, I think it was 2019 when they held it. And I'm fascinated by junk science. There's a really excellent book, Anatomy of Innocence.
Yeah.
It's nonfiction, and it's not the Innocence Project, but it's similar in Chicago, where they help get money for people who've been in prison for crimes they didn't commit and then are exonerated. And they had every one of the chapters has a best-selling author paired up with an exoneree. And I was paired up with a guy who was in prison, I think it was maybe 30 years, but for murder he didn't commit, but some of the evidence against him was a corpse-sniffing dog. And this guy claimed that he had a dog that could sniff a corpse and then sniff possible suspects and would be able to say this is, alert to the person who had been in contact with the corpse. It's absolute nonsense. But this is the type of thing prosecutors, this guy was eventually outed by, I think, 60 Minutes, and then there's a judge who excoriated him in an opinion. They had to let a number of people off death row because of this phony evidence. But the prosecutors will sometimes put forward these theories, and they probably believe them. I mean, but it turns out they're not scientifically valid. So one of the hour-long talks at the seminar was about shaken baby. And I didn't know very much about it, but I sort of, makes sense that the shaken baby syndrome is if you have a child who has internal injuries. It's retinal hemorrhaging, cerebral edema. I can't remember all three of them, but it's a triad. And if these three internal injuries exist, but there's no external signs of violence, like no, bruises or, skull fracture or anything, what'll happen is that the prosecutor will put forward a theory that the baby must have been shaken, and that's accounts for why, and then it's usually the last person in contact. Could be a babysitter or boyfriend or husband or whatever, or wife, and they get charged with assault. So it sort of made sense to me, but what I found out was that this theory is completely without any scientific foundation. And the way it originated, which is fascinating, is back in the 70s when they weren't talking about spousal abuse or child abuse. Mm-hmm. Doctors started seeing these children with these injuries, but no external evidence. So they came to the conclusion that the child must have been shaken. Now, they never anticipated that this would be used in a criminal prosecution. They were using it to educate doctors and parents and stuff. Don't shake your child, because this could be a real problem. Prosecutors got a hold of it and started prosecuting people whose children, showed these the triad, but didn't have any external injuries. Well, there's a problem with this. Usually, if you have a scientific theory, you get a hypothesis. So my hypothesis is that if you have cancer and you eat hot dogs, it'll cure cancer. So that's a valid hypothesis. It might be true, might not be true. So what do? We test it. You get a bunch of cancer patients, they eat hot dogs. If they get cured, you've found a cure for cancer. If they don't, it doesn't work. Well, what's the problem with this shaken baby syndrome? How would you test it? you would get 1,000 people to take a human baby and shake them as violent as they could. And of course, everybody would get arrested and put in prison. So you can't test the theory. At some point, when this was being used for prosecutions, there was I mentioned the name in the book, but there was a neurologist who got the idea of testing this hypothesis with biomechanics. So she hired got a bunch of football players to shake crash dummies. They eventually started using the ones that NASA and the automobile industry use. And they found that no football player was able to shake these dummies with enough force to create the type of torque you need to create these injuries. So there's absolutely no scientific evidence that supports this theory. There were two commissions, one in Canada, one in England, that had full-scale investigations because there were a lot of people in prison with these charges because of the shaken baby. And they came to the conclusion that it's not scientifically based, and they were letting people out of prison because they felt that they had been convicted on something that wasn't scientifically proven. So I got this information at the coast, and I thought it was fascinating because my understanding is that the majority of people in the medical profession still consider this to be valid. But there's an increasing minority that are saying you shouldn't be using this. So there's two sides to it. And I was really lucky. We had a number of shaken baby cases in Oregon, and I called up the Attorney General office and the public defender, and I was able to get transcripts from real cases where experts had talked, and that helped me to make the trial in the book where Robin is representing a surrogate mother who is by a mistake allowed to bond with the baby that she gives birth to, and who then ends up getting a psychiatric condition where she believes the baby is hers, and there's a conspiracy, and she kidnaps the baby and is arrested for kidnapping, assault on the baby when they find the triad, and then other charges. So this shaken baby syndrome is the basis for the charge with the kid. So I set up this trial where Robin is able, both sides put on their evidence, they're experts, and so it was a lot of fun doing that. I fortunately have a really good friend, Jeff Weiss, who lives in Scottsdale part of the year, by the way. He's in Florida right now, but he's a doctor and a pediatric surgeon, so I asked him to review the stuff to see if I was making mistakes, and he helped me rewrite things that weren't working. So I give him high praise in my acknowledgments. But that trial was loads of fun to write.
So how does the medical community deal with the fact that these babies have injuries? I mean, the injuries are real, so, how do they happen?
Oh, and I go into this in the book. There are tons of explanations for the types of injuries that have nothing to do with someone shaking the baby. Sometimes they're from birth. They can be from a fall, a short fall. There's a lot. I have like 10 or 15 things that during cross-examination by Robin that she brings out in the book, all the possible explanations that have nothing to do with the defendant in the case shaking the baby.
Very true. It is. I mean, it is a legal thriller. There is a trial, but there's a number of tricky things that happen in the book. So how does it begin?
Okay, so I had fun doing some of the titles for the parts, but one is murder with benefits. Like Friends with Benefits, or Murder with Benefits. So Marjorie Lohman, in the first chapter, two police officers come to Marjorie Lohman's
McMansion.
Horrible, ugly McMansion in the middle of this small town in Oregon, where it's just absolutely out of place. And they tell her that her husband Joel has been tortured and murdered and found in a dumpster in Portland, and they get a response that they don't expect, because she bursts out laughing and says that's the best news she's heard in years, because Joel is been cheating with her, is living with his girlfriend in a penthouse, they're going through a horrible divorce, and he's hidden all their money, and he converted it to gold and has hidden it someplace in the world. And so since she's not divorced, she can get everything from, she's still his spouse. So
but let me just add this: if he had made a will, which apparently he didn't, she wouldn't be entitled to all the money. So
he didn't expect to drop dead either.
No, I understand that, but I mean, I think it's not just because she's still married to him. She would have been entitled to some share, but not the whole thing, right?
I don't do that area, so. But I think if this, I don't know what the law is in Oregon about what a spouse gets if her husband dies, even if he tries to do a will, it may not work.
I think the spouse gets a share, but the spouse doesn't necessarily walk off with all of it if there's.
Well, it's my book, and he didn't write a will.
I just wanted to bring that up.
So it's tough, Barbara.
Sorry. I liked wills and trusts in estates. That was one of my favorite parts of law school.
Well, if you had been my editor, you might have brought that up, but fortunately you weren't, so I didn't have to deal with that.
I'm just saying, I think it was assumed in the book that he hadn't written a will. And you're right. I mean, lawyers are actually notoriously the last people who write wills, even though you would think that they should. But it's surprising how many lawyers die intestate.
So Marjorie gets involved with gangsters who Joel owed money to, and then it turns out he's embezzled money from his firm, and so she's afraid these gangsters are going to get her, so she takes off and goes to Elk Grove, which is where Robin grew up, and becomes the surrogate mother that she represents. Now, I'm not going to tell you why Robin ends up in Elk Grove, because that's one of the big surprises in the book. But she goes back home, and while she's there, the lawyer who's representing Marjorie in these cases knows that she's a hotshot attorney, and he hasn't handled big cases the way she has. So he asks her to help him out, brainstorm, and she ends up co-counseling with him. So that's how she gets involved. But she's back in Elk Grove where she grew up, and I'd always, in the back of my mind, wanted to do a plot where she went home, because she has an interesting relationship with her mother. Her mother is very upset that she went to law school and didn't stay in Elk Grove and get married and have children. So they always have this sort of dialogue when they're on the phone. Why is she in Oregon practicing? Why isn't she come back to, Elk Grove to practice? And, has she got a man in her life? That type of thing. So the mothers, I enjoy the mom as a character, and I give her an opportunity to have be in a lot more scenes and show her relationship with Robin in the book.
Actually, Robin uses her mother and her mother's friends as a kind of
sounding
board during the trial, trying to figure out how the jury might be viewing things and how the jury might vote. So, I mean, there's some complicated legal questions involved here, not just the baby. And unfortunately, we can't really talk about them because we're going to ruin the book for you. Is this a book where I can see, is this a book where you really thought it out carefully? Because it would be hard to write this book without, I think, some sort of outline.
Yeah, I mean, I always outline. Do you want me to talk about?
I think that's fine.
I have the Phil Margolin, it's based on the Ford Motor Company assembly line thing. So when I started out, I had 2 books I wrote. I've had a very strange, bizarre writing career. But I wrote my first 2 books in my 30s. in 1978, the first one came out. In 81, the second one came out when I had a full-time law practice.
Hearthstone?
Yeah, Hearthstone, then The Last Innocent Man.
Yeah, you were practicing at the same time?
Yeah, yeah, and I actually practiced during my first 5 books. I had a full-time law practice and raising 2 kids, and so it was. I had to be organized. Let me just put it that way. And so I developed this system, and I always advise people that want to write a book. You know, the first thing I advise them is don't write. Once you get your idea, there's this natural instinct to sit down and immediately write. And I said never write, think. And what I do is I spend a lot of time. I got the little idea. Oh, let's do a book where there's a shaken baby case, okay? But then I don't sit down and write anything. I start thinking out who the characters, who's the bad guy going to be, what's the good guy going to be, and eventually I will get the ending. Who's the bad guy? How they get caught? If I don't do that, I don't write the book. And I was talking before about Executive Privilege, which is one of my best books. Could the President of the United States be a serial killer? Well, I got that idea in 1995. And I had ideas for who the characters would be and set up. I just could not, for the life of me, think of the ending. Because how the President has Secret Service around him and the press, how would he get away with it? So I kept on making notes over the years, you know, and I put it in a file that I had. But it wasn't until 2006 that I was driving back from Central Oregon on vacation, and I just finished the book, and I was trying to think what my next book should be, and bing, into my head comes the ending for that book. So 10 years later, right, the book came out in 2008, and it took me 10 years, but, you know, it's my rule is if you can't figure out how you end it, you don't write it, because I've read a number of books that infuriate me, that they're fabulous, fabulous books, and then the ending is like stupid. And it just, I feel like I wasted all my money, and then people will write me very nasty letters and be mean to me, so I try to avoid that. So the first thing I do is get the idea and then think, get the ending. Once I have the ending, I spend 1 to 3 months on an outline, and I literally go from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. So my outlines are usually about 25 to 30 pages. I had one that was 60. And the advantage of that, there's a bunch of advantages. And there's a big debate, outline, don't outline. And I don't get the don't outline people. But basically what the advantage is, as you are writing your outline, you have all these fabulous ideas, but then when you really think about them, they don't work. And so instead of writing 400 pages and finding that the idea doesn't work, if I get to a point and I say, wait a second, this sounded really good when I started, but it's really not that good an idea, I've got to change it. All I have to do is change part of 20 pages or 25 pages instead of 400. So it's quite normal for me to move stuff around the outline. And if I'm spending 6 hours a day, 5 days a week in my office, just thinking about it, I'm getting all sorts of cool ideas for other characters that might be necessary, different scenes, but I'm not writing, I'm thinking. So I'm immersed in this book all this time, just getting these ideas and working out problems with the novel, and then adding good stuff. And then once I get the outline done, the book's written. It's just like the Reader's Digest condensed book. So I just take each paragraph and I make it a chapter. And then the first draft is never publishable. It's usually pretty crappy. There's some good stuff and some bad. And then I spend months polishing it, editing it for quality. So, the rewriting is one of the most important things with books. So your first draft is usually crap. But the reason for that is, you're just putting stuff down on the page to get it out of your head, and you're not thinking about whether the sentences are well written or, other problems that are going to pop up. And so then I consider my my first draft, like a 400-page outline, basically, and then I spend tons of time rewriting it for quality. So now you know everything I know about writing. I only had one writing class in my whole life, and I got a C+ in creative writing in college, so I'm totally self-taught, and that's the only, you just now have heard everything I know.
Well, every writer has his or her own process, you know, whatever happens to work. I think creative minds all work differently. And, you know, what if this is right for Phil, but it wouldn't necessarily be right for somebody else. But I think, and also I think my experiences over the years talking to authors, and Patrick can chime in, is that if you found one that works, most authors stick with it. It's very rare that an author, you know, changes up the whole way they do things, isn't it?
Well, one thing that I always make clear if I'm teaching a writing class is that there isn't any one correct way to write.
Right.
I always tell people, you know, this is what works for me, and here's why. But any process that gets you from page 1 to the end is brilliant. You know, so the thing I think about people that don't outline and just write is really they're basically doing the same thing I do, because they write the draft and they just sort of skip the outlining stages, and then they've got to work on quality, you know. So while they're writing, they're sort of doing the same thing I'm thinking about, is thinking about the stuff. So they're really doing an outline, but they're just doing a big outline instead of a little outline. So, but you're right. I mean, everybody's got a different process, and if you get to the end with that process, and it's brilliant, it's incredibly good. But I think the way I do it is more structured. And for, you know, somebody who's just trying to get started, I think the idea of not just sitting down and writing, but thinking about things and working things out. And then my fear would be if I didn't do the outline, I just wrote, what if I spend 3 years writing the book and I can't end it? You know, but so that's the big problem I see. And again, like I said, there's a number of books that I've read over the years where, and maybe it's because they have a deadline, you know, a contract, you have to have it in by December or something. But you have this book that I won't tell who the writer was, because but a really good, you know, very famous mystery writer. And this book was so good, I was telling my wife, oh, you got to read this. This is fantastic. And then the ending was so stupid. I just got so upset, and I said, what is going on here? This is really moronic. And I said, if the guy had just spent a little bit more time in thinking about it, nothing gets tied up. You know, there was a very complex murder case, and then it turns out some mafia guys who were never introduced are the ones that did one of the killings, and the other murder was by something else, and they were completely unrelated. And I'm going, you know, you spent all this time writing a really good book, and then you just didn't bother to think about how to tie it up. So
It's bad when you feel cheated.
yeah. I mean, especially if you paid actual currency
money for the book.
Yeah, you laid down like it was $20 or whatever it is for the book, and then you get to the end and you realize the guy wasn't willing to take the time to really think things out.
Any of them, any best-selling authors with the lousy, the stupid endings?
Yes, but I won't say who it is, because that's, you know,
many
it's
books
not nice.
that are disappointing in the ending. The maxim should be that the end should be as good as the beginning. It's easier to have a great idea to start a book than it is sometimes to work your way all the way through it. And, you know, there are writers that I've talked to who go down rabbit holes because they haven't outlined it all, and that's part of the fun for them, is to, you know, back up. Revision is a critical part of turning in a good book. Sometimes people just run out of time. You know, there was an author I truly loved who wrote some of the best plots ever, British author, and wrote one of the worst books I ever read. And I said to him, I wrote him, I said, what happened here? And that's what he said. He said he ran out of time. And, you know, all of a sudden the IRA shows up in the middle of the ocean and all, and that's the solution of the book. And I'm going, where did they come from? Why are they here? You know, and I guess he felt like he couldn't, you know, bust his contract deadline. And so forth.
What he should have done is called up his editor and said, I don't want this. you should have pride in your what you're doing. And if you can't deliver a polished work, I mean, it's a contract between me and the reader. I'm asking you to, read this book, and you're paying money for it. I have an obligation to tie everything up. So and what your point is really a point I made before. Every book starts off, especially if it's a published book, with a really great idea. That's what gets you going. You say, oh, wow, could President be a serial killer? Or what if I had a trial with a shaken baby? So you get these great ideas. So if you didn't get the great idea, the exciting idea, you wouldn't write it. So my thing is exactly what you said. I won't, if you have a brilliant idea, you have to have a brilliant ending. It's that both ends have to match up. And Gone but Not Forgotten was my first huge bestseller. And I got an idea for a screenplay initially, and I was working with a friend who was doing a screenplay of one of my books. And I had this memo that I wrote for this plot, but I had sort of painted myself into a corner, and I came to him and he said, wow, this is great. How's it end? I said, well, I don't know. Can you help me? And so we were never able to figure out the ending, so I just put the memo away, and then a couple of years later got the idea for how to, end the thing, and then I wrote it, and it turned out to be a really good book. But I don't think you should present a book to the public unless both ends of it are really good. And I think it's a question of honor. It's a moral thing for me not to put out a piece of crap. So I think he should have just said, I need more time with this, and let me take it back. And I've actually pulled a book. One of my books, I'd written it. I've had great editors. This one editor was not good. Unfortunately, it was just one book. And I had finished the book, sent it in, and assumed that we were going to have some editing conference. And she said, oh, no, this is fine. We're just going to go with it. Well, my agent, who's a brilliant editor, Jennifer Wells, had not had a chance to read the book yet. Her mom was my agent at the time, a main agent, and then she's retired since. But Jennifer was her daughter, and turns out not only is a great agent, but she's a brilliant editor. And she had gotten a chance. I was back in New York, and she says, this book's got a lot of problems, Phil. And she's done that a couple of times. And she says, you need to do a lot of work on this. So I call up the editor. I said, don't do a thing with this book. I'm taking it back to Portland, and I rewrote the whole thing from scratch and handed it in a couple of months later. I'm always ahead of deadline. I'm quick, but I just jerked it back because she pointed out all these problems, and I didn't want to hand in something that wasn't good. So I've actually
You
done
didn't
that.
see the problems?
No. If you write the thing and you hand it in, you obviously are, if I saw the problems, I would have rewritten it.
I understand.
So that's why I need good editors. The editor's job is to point out where you've screwed up. I always explain it. Let's say you and I are playing chess, okay? And beating you is the most important thing in my life. I have been practicing this chess to beat you for 5 or 10 years. So this game is the most important thing in my entire life. And so I'm playing white, and after an hour I make a move where I put my knight on a certain square. Well, you're looking at the book at the board from a totally different perspective. You're not looking, and you don't know what's in my head. So you look at the board and say, oh, I've got a checkmate in 3. Well, it's not that I didn't try. I tried the hardest anyone could ever try in their life to do well at this game. But I messed up. I didn't see something. And so that's the editor's job, is to take a look at your work that you've put everything into and you really think is working, and show you where you're wrong, where you've screwed up. And then as a writer, my job is to not get mad. It's to have an open mind. And I always tell editors, please never tell me anything you like about my book, because if you like it, it means it's working. I want to know what you don't like, why you don't like it. So don't just say this stinks. Say this stinks because, and then give me some suggestions on how to fix it. Do you?
Yeah, I do have a question. have you ever showed an editor your outline?
No, I just, what I try to do, the process I have is, I really work hard on these, but I do tons of editing. So I don't want to waste the time of the editor. So I try to write the best book I can, and then Jennifer the agent is she's really a brilliant editor, and she's my first reader. She's the only person who looks at it, and then if she thinks it's, a lot of times she'll say, okay, there's going to be some editing done. This is good enough to go to Keith Kaler, who's a great editor. He's my editor of St. Martin's. This is good enough. She'll just ship it over. If she thinks there's a problem, she'll say, Phil, there's some problems. This, and this is not working. And then I'll take it back and revise it. So I still will spend a lot of time, with Keith editing it, because she doesn't do the editing stuff. She just wants to have the book where she feels like it's publishable quality, assuming that there's going to be changes made.
So you started a series with St. Martin's, and this is book 5. How do you feel about writing a series versus writing a standalone?
So when I started my career, I intentionally stayed away from series.
Right.
And there's a reason for it. Gone But Not Forgotten was this huge bestseller. It sold over 1 million copies, a movie and everything. So my gut reaction when I was thinking, what should my next book be? Another Betsy Tannenbaum serial killer book, a sequel. And then I remembered Sherlock Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle hated Sherlock Holmes. He really wanted to write historical novels, and every time he'd write something that wasn't a Sherlock Holmes book, nobody would read it, and they'd say, when are you going to do another Sherlock? So I'm thinking, what if the next book in the Betsy Tannenbaum series is twice as successful? Then I'll be stuck writing Betsy Tannenbaum serial killer books for the rest of my life, and I'll shoot myself in the head. I'll get so bored. So I intentionally stayed away. Every one of the books after that was a standalone. No, not the same character. The 7th book I wrote was Wild Justice, which was Amanda and Frank Jaffe's first book. And I really loved the characters, but it was a standalone. It wasn't going to be a series. The next book was The Associate. And the main character in that is a guy he's an associate in a big law firm and gets charged with a murder he didn't commit. So I got to get him a defense attorney. So I was going to make one up, and then I said, yeah, I like that Amanda Jaffe from that other, but I'll just give her a cameo role. So she's in The Associate as his lawyer for a couple of, maybe 70 pages off and on. The next book I wrote was Ties That Bind, and in the outline, the Jaffes were not in the outline. But after I read the outline, I said, the Jaffes would fit into this perfectly. But I said, and I'd never written a book where I had to continue the life of a fictional character. And I said, well, that'd be an interesting challenge. Could I do it? So that was my second Amanda and Frank Jaffe book. And then I went back to write standalones, and every once in a while I have 5 Amanda and Frank Jaffes, but they're scattered. Then I did Executive Privilege and one about the president, and that was going to be a standalone. But it was so successful with the people at HarperCollins said, can you write a sequel? And just by chance, Brad Miller, one of the characters in the book, gets a job as an associate, as a clerk to a Supreme Court justice. So the first one's in the executive branch. So I said, oh, well, he's over, I'll do some book set in the Supreme Court. So I did that, and then those clerkships are only a year, and I think it was when the recession was coming, and I didn't want Brad to be out of work and not be able to get a job, so I got him a job as a legislative assistant to a U.S. senator in the legislative branch. So that was the 3, really. Dana Cutler's the main character.
Your government trilogy.
Yeah, that's my Washington trilogy. And then I did one other Dana Cutler because she was so popular, where none of the other, the first 3 books have the same group of characters solving the murders, an FBI agent and Brad's girlfriend, and so they're all in the 3 books, and then I just gave her her own book. But then I did a bunch of standalones also.
What about the Worthy Brown
Oh, that's my best book ever. That took 30 years to write, so I don't think I'm going to be able to do a sequel. I have a due date, and I don't think I'd have to be over 100 years old to do the sequel. Worthy Brown's Daughter was inspired by the 1853 Oregon Territorial Supreme Court case that held that you could not have slaves in Oregon. And people never think about Oregon as slavery, but we had about 70 slaves. Most of them came with owners from Missouri in the 1840s and 50s. And there was a 12-year hiatus between my second and third books. What happened was, when I was a kid, the only thing because of Perry Mason, the only thing I wanted to do was murder cases. So that was, I never thought about being a writer ever. And the same year that my first book came out, I argued at the U.S. Supreme Court. I think it was 34 years old. And then in between the two books, I started getting hired to do major appeals and big murder cases. So that's what that was my passion. That's what I really wanted to do. So I just put the writing after my second book on Last Innocent Man on the back burner and concentrated on my law practice, which got really exciting. But during that 12-year stretch between Last Innocent Man and 1993, when Gone came out, I ran across this Holmes versus Ford case that decided they couldn't have slaves. And the real case is it's a tearjerker. A group of this Colonel Nathaniel Ford was a very successful landowner and slave owner in Missouri, and then the economy went belly up. So he did what you used to do in the in the 1800s. If you failed in one area, just move someplace, and you could get a free square mile of land in Oregon, and 2 if you were married, if you agreed to farm it. So he just picked up, and he had a whole bunch of slaves, the Holmes family. He'd sold a lot of their kids off already. But he said, if you come to Oregon and help me build this farm, I'll free you. So they had several children, 3 or 4, it's confusing. I think they may have had given birth to one of them after they moved. But they helped him build the farm, and then he sort of reneged in part. So he let the adults go free. But he said, your kids were really little, and I clothed and fed them. They were no use to me. They couldn't work. But now they're older, they can work. They have to work off what I invested in them. So it was illegal to educate a slave in Missouri. And so these were they were fairly intelligent, but they were totally illiterate. They couldn't read, they couldn't write, obviously couldn't be lawyers. And they got the process, and no one knows how this happened. But the prosecuting attorney for Oregon agreed to represent him and file a suit in habeas corpus, means to get the kids back in civil court. And eventually they did get the kids back, but one of them died when in the custody of Ford. So it's a horribly sad case, not as a lawyer, but as a writer. I thought, how would I feel if someone kidnapped my kid? I had 2 kids, and I knew where they were, and everyone knew where they were, but I couldn't get them back because of the color of my skin. So I thought, boy, that'd be an interesting subject for a novel. Well, I had only had 1 history course in all of college. I was really not that interested, and it wasn't in Oregon history. And then if you're going to write a book, you've got to make it realistic. Well, I didn't know anything about what it would be like to be a lawyer or just live in 1800. How would you get water? Did you open your refrigerator and take a plastic bottle out? Did they have faucets? Did they have wells? How did you do it? Did people brush their teeth? So you have to get all this information to make the book realistic. So I spent 6 years in the Oregon Historical Society Library reading diaries of people from that time and doing research there in Multnomah County Public Library. And then this is a funny story. I wrote the book, I finished it, and I sent it to my agent. And I was really proud of this book. And she got back to me and said, this book is horrible. No one will buy this book. So I said, okay, because it was my law practice was, this was just sort of like a fun hobby at this point. So I put it away, Then I hit the big time with a whole bunch of New York Times bestsellers, and at some point I had finished way ahead of deadline, so I had some free time, and I said, well, I like that historical novel. Let me look at it. And so I took it out again. And I said, oh, wow, there are problems with it. So I rewrote it, and I sent it to my agent. She said, this book is awful. If I try to get this published, your career will be ended. So I said, okay. And I went back and wrote another New York Times bestselling contemporary thriller. So then years later, again, I had a dead spot because I was way ahead of, and by this time, Jean had retired, and Jennifer was now running the agency, and she'd never seen the book. So I rewrote it, and I gave it to her, and I said, what do you think? She said, this book's awful. She said, nobody's going to buy this book, but she told me why. And as I said, she's a fabulous editor. And she sat me down. She said everything that was a problem in this book, why it wasn't working. And so I went home, and I rewrote the book from page one, spent 8 hours a day for a couple of months, just rewriting it, and it's really a good book now. So HarperCollins bought it, and it's the book I'm proudest of. It's got a murder case with a surprise ending and stuff, but it's more about dealing with loss of a spouse and slavery. I said it in 1860 because that's when Abraham Lincoln was running for president, and slavery was a major issue. And instead of having a whole family, I just have Worthy Brown and his daughter Roxanne, who is kept by the person. So that's a long-winded answer to your short question.
I actually have a quick question about the importance of character names. I noticed in the new book you have a Loman. I was thinking, is that a little nod to Willie Loman?
No, that's one of I was actually played Happy Loman in Death of a Salesman, and you're not only looking at an author, but I've had a role. I had two movies made, and I got to have a part in one of them. And so you're in the presence of a movie star and a stage actor, as well as a writer. No, that's my deep dark secret. Is the way I get names is I have. I used to have the yellow pages. They don't do that anymore. But I have the Oregon State Bar Directory, and I stick my finger in, and I get a first name, and then I get a last name. I'm very uncreative. I used to be a competitive chess player, so we get the U.S. Chess Federation thing. So any of the foreign names are usually names of grandmasters, chess players. I'm really a dud when it comes to actually inventing names. I don't do it very well.
Lots of people have used the Found Directory or Yellow Pages too.
Yeah.
It's harder with historicals because you do have to have names that are accurate to the time, and there are fashions in names too. I mean, we know that you can almost tell the age of some kids, by whatever name they've got.
Well, if someone knows how to be really creative with names, please send me. Look on my website, and you can contact me on the website and send me the secret. But I've never been able to figure it out. I'm really lousy at doing names.
It's worked for you. The real secret is not to have too many names in a book that sound alike. You don't want to have, John and James and Jimmy as your three male leads, for example, because it's just too hard for often for the reader. I forget stuff. I forget the plots of most of the books I've written, so I have to go back and reread it. But I will frequently find that I'm using the same names for different people. And oh my God, because I thought, popped into my head, oh, this would be a good last name. And then I realized that you're recycling one.
Yeah, 20 pages before or 50 pages before I'd use the same name. So fortunately, when I'm, rereading it for editing purposes, I usually catch it, or my editor will if I screw up.
Anybody else have a question? Patrick, do you have another one?
I'm not a reader of yours, but so
what?
excited to embark upon my first book. What should I read?
Well, there's a couple I'd suggest. The first book in the Robin Lockwood series, Third Victim, I think is pretty good. Gone But Not Forgotten and Executive Privilege are probably my two best thrillers. And then Worthy Brown, but it's an outlier. It's not, all my other books are contemporary legal thrillers. Okay. So, and if you don't like those, you won't like the rest of my, but they're really, I try to make every single book different. Like even the Robin Lockwood series and the series, every one of those could be read as a standalone. So, you know, I hate it if I'm reading a series for the first time and I get book number 4 and then I have no idea what the hell's going on. You know, who are these people? And, you know, so I try to rewrite every book to make it like a standalone. So if you hadn't read other books in the series, you can just read it and not have a
There's
problem.
a handy list in the books about, and you'll see that they're groups. So they're like 5 Amanda Jaffes and 4 Dana Cutlers.
Right.
This is now the 5th Robin Lockwood, but there's a dozen standalones.
And I have this is weird. I think it's because of COVID, but I have 2 books, 2 Robin Lockwoods coming out this year.
You do?
So November 8th, and you can actually see the cover. They have the cover. They put it online already. But November 8th, Murder at Black Oaks is coming out, and I'm still editing it. It's back in New York. It's an homage to Agatha Christie.
Oh, wonderful.
So it takes,
I love the title.
Well, it takes, Black Oaks is a brick-by-brick recreation of a haunted manor on the British moors with a werewolf legend.
Okay.
And Robin is trapped in Black Oaks with this cast of characters that includes an escaped lunatic from the mental hospital, a butler who's horribly scarred. There's a werewolf legend, and the thing I am most excited about, and I hope you can try to figure it out, a locked room murder in a cage elevator stuck between the 2nd and 3rd floor of the mansion, where the person is stabbed to death with a dagger that has a werewolf claw silver handle, half human, half wolf, but the handle is too wide to get through the bars. So the killer had to be inside the cage elevator when he stabbed the victim. How do you get out? Because there are people, as soon as the alarm comes out, that are coming out on the landing, looking down at the elevator, and coming up from the 1st floor, and so had the killer get out of the cage. So I really spent a lot of time working out the ins and outs.
I bet you did. If that's your writing process, you must have given a lot of thought.
I had to do a lot of restructuring and said, okay, wait a second, this has got to work.
Is this house in Oregon, or have you sent her to England?
No, the Black Oaks is on the top of Solitude Mountain in the middle of nowhere in Oregon. I made up Solitude Mountain. So, and the road, I forgot, the road has been washed out, so there's no escape, and the police can't get up, and there are murders in the mansion.
It is a full-out Agatha Christie.
It's fun, and there's secret passages in the mansion. It's straight out of a 1940s, golden age mystery. So I had tons of fun writing, and now I'm also 40-something pages into the one after that. So that's another Robin Lockwood. So while I've been waiting for the editor to get back to me from New York, I've been starting another.
COVID has been productive for you. It's interesting that some writers have been largely paralyzed, but other writers that we've talked to, have one recently, Patrick, have been super productive because they're not distracted by, actual life and traveling and so forth. So it's an interesting, your temperament has a lot to do, I guess, with how it's gone. Well, this has really been a lot of fun to listen to Phil talk about his writing process. We can't say a lot more about The Darkest Place, but there are several surprising twists in this book, and when you get to the end, you can decide whether Robin did the right thing and whether justice will really be served. Being a defense attorney has its challenges, and one of them is, to how far can you go in representing a client, and how do you feel about it if you've made a mistake?
I try to put moral and ethical dilemmas into the books.
Yeah,
because I think it makes it more interesting. They're all whodunits. There's always a surprise ending and twist, but then I think if you have a moral and ethical dilemma that you face as a defense attorney, it also presents, the readers say, oh, well, if I was a lawyer, would I have done this, or what would I have done? So I think it makes it the book more interesting, because there's the mystery aspects, and then there's also these moral and ethical problems that, you know, you say, well, what if I was a lawyer, would I have done
Well,
this?
they tend to arise, I think, more on the defense part than they do on the prosecutors. But there are prosecutors who face moral dilemmas too, or questions about if they're, you know, they're sure somebody's guilty, but they don't think they can convict them. How far can they go to, you know, try to make that happen? But legal thrillers do have that extra. Private eyes don't necessarily wrestle with moral dilemmas while they're in pursuit. Cops, of course, have to do that, and they're constrained by rules. So, you know, every genre has its questions.
Are the two cops, Dylan and I can't remember the
Carrie Anders and Roger.
featured in all of the books?
They're not in the Agatha Christie one, but they're in this one, and they're in. Yeah, there's a
nice counterpoint between
yeah,
thriller
and they have there's a relationship that Robin has with Carrie where they occasionally will meet at this tavern and sort of work out stuff between themselves, and that's been sort of fun. But as I was with that note about the prosecutor, I always say the best defense attorney is an honest prosecutor, because an honest prosecutor will not bring a case to trial unless they're convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that the person actually did it. So I've, over the course of my career, it didn't happen that often, but I've had prosecutors who, after I've given them, you know, discovery and stuff, have said, "Oh, yeah, okay, we're going to dismiss the case." Doesn't happen that often, but you know, if you have a really, and I got along really well with. I was a very pro-prosecution defense attorney. I was very successful, won a lot of cases, but I always respected the DAs and the U.S. attorneys, and most of them were really decent people, and so, you know, they would try to do the right thing if in situations where you could really show them that they really shouldn't be bringing the case. That didn't happen that often, because usually when, contrary, not just like, it's not like on TV, but usually when police arrest somebody, they do get the right person. I'd say about 90% of the time, the people I was representing over 25 years, they did the bad thing.
And hopefully, as evidence is becoming actually more science-based and so forth, and you know, then there's a greater likelihood that the person is guilty. I mean, you know, lineups and the dog and, you know, other things, eyewitnesses, that kind of thing, are really inherently unreliable. But as we're moving more towards, you know, real forensics, although, you know, you only have to look back at the O.J. Simpson case to recognize that even forensics, you know, sometimes blow up.
Well, that case, I mean, I used to think that, you know, all lawyers in Oregon were all hicks, and these L.A. lawyers are really smart. And boy, that convinced me that that was wrong. And that was one of the worst tried cases I've ever seen. And the biggest thing was the DNA evidence.
Yeah.
If you do scientific evidence, you do it in like 2 seconds. You do not spend 2 weeks on DNA, because all you had to do in that case was get, and my wife pointed this out, there's a little cartoon at the beginning of Jurassic Park that explains DNA. And it, I don't know, lasts maybe 3 minutes. And all you had to do is get the guy on and say, DNA evidence is infallible, period. And then you take all of the pictures where blood was found, and you say, where'd you get this blood? Oh, I found it at the scene of the murder. And whose blood is it? It's O.J. Simpson's blood. I mean, they could have done that in like I did neutron activation analysis in 20 minutes in the case. So with the scientific stuff, you get in, you get out, you tell your expert, please, I'm an idiot when it comes to science. So they would have to explain it to me so I understood it. And then I would put them on the stand and have them talk to the jury the same way they talk to me. And you should be able to do this stuff really fast. And if
physical evidence still in existence, you think, in that case?
Yeah, I mean, probably he lost the civil case because they had the I for one think there might have been the right verdict in the murder case because they tried it so poorly that they created reasonable doubt. You know, but the civil case, you know, it's a lower standard. It's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's preponderance
It
of the
doesn't have
evidence.
to be unanimous either.
Yeah,
No,
but
it
it
doesn't have to be.
it's just more likely than not. So the more likely than not, there's no question. You know, he did the murders, but the prosecution screwed the case up so badly with the.
And the judge didn't help. I mean, you know, there are occasionally really bad judges on the bench that don't improve things. There was one in Wisconsin recently that was just a joke. So there we go. In any case, I want to thank you for your attention and thank Phil for joining us and thank Patrick for doing the video. Thank you all for joining us. And now we could sign a book or two and we'll be done. So thank you. Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.